Thomas Berry is a Catholic theologian. And I think what he places before us is the biggest challenge of our era, both within the Judaic-Christian tradition and the world around us. It's all a question of story. We are in trouble just now because we do not have a good story. We are in between stories. Old story, the account of how we fit into it is no longer effective, yet we have not yet learned the new story. So I think I remember sharing this with you once before, but by the 14th century, as a result of the Black Plague, a new narrative was sealed. And it was actually sealed by the church. And it went like this: Black Plague, total devastation of the human race. I don't think all the theologians saw it this way, but let's just say the ones who were in charge, who were deeply connected with the political powers who were in charge, suggested in looking around the world that, wow, this was a huge punishment for the sinfulness of human beings. And you can see what that might do in terms of locking in a new story. So God, on his throne, was declaring that human beings were deeply sinful, and the story unfolded then that perpetuated then a real and final separation between God in heaven and people on earth. So before that time, the lines weren't so completely drawn. The other piece of that, then, is that salvation needed to come from the outside because earth and its people were so problematic. So that piece of the story, as you can understand, is now wildly problematic and always has been. So we just ended up with this dualism: God in heaven, we on earth. We being sinful unless we are saved by God in heaven to put us in this new place. So I'm going to just put on the screen here what I think may be, and it's certainly not an exclusive list, the foundations for the new story. And one of the reasons I think it's really important for us is as we continue, and you will now see on our sign, it's official, we have identified ourselves as a circle of friends for the better part of 12 years, but now it's like in everybody's face. And I think it's really important, if people are asking us questions, how we speak to our understanding of that. And the language that we use. So, these are just 5. And there are probably more. But as a community of friends, we had a conversation a long time ago about whether our community embraced theism or pantheism. And I've told you this before, but there were, I think, 38 of us in the hall having a workshop, and 2 out of 38 were theists, which means that 2 out of 38 still believed that God was out there. Just there. Whereas the other 36, and I can also tell you that the people in the room were from age 45 to 85, all thought, no, it's a bit mysterious and probably can't completely explain it. But God is in us, in all living things. Probably at this point, physics and biology do a better job about talking about how that mystery is among us. So we really need to, I think, clearly identify ourselves as pantheists or panentheists as opposed to theists. And then we need to go and look at our hymn book and see how many hymns in our hymn book are still using theistic language. It's a bit of a frustration. From temple to table. So I think it's very interesting that within our tradition, Jesus cleared the temple made a big critique of the temple, made a big critique of the institution, the religious institution that it established, a pecking order with all kinds of rules and hierarchy, etc., where people were clearly in and people were clearly out. And what did he provide us with? A table. You want to understand how you come together and experience the mystery together? Get yourself to a table and break bread with people who may not even be like you. From heaven to earth, this whole heaven thing, Jesus didn't really talk about heaven, but once again, the way things evolved, right, it goes back to the Black Plague, right? I mean, if earth is such a problem, and if this is the place we have to be afraid of being punished for our own sinfulness that we can't even help, then our real home, our real destination then is heaven. Because earth is not necessarily our home. We're passing through. I can name you, and a dozen 19th century hymns that reflect that theology. So we've got a kind of, like my favorite theological professor, Doug Hall, I think within the first 2 classes he said a lot of wonderful things, but one of them was, this is not a dress rehearsal. Yeah. So what did I say next? I didn't say this very well, but I think you know what I mean. From human-centered to biosphere-centered. So we have made decisions over the eons as though we were the center of the biosphere, of the creation. And we are well aware of the consequences for that. But I won't say that. And finally, from theology to cosmology. So, if the language of theology, and the root is theos, God, and that theos is actually God that is other, if that's going to perpetuate this very dualistic understanding of our role in the world and everybody else is kind of revolving around us and we're revolving around God, that also has pretty significant negative consequences. So the new story really needs to be a cosmological story because we now realize that we live in this spectacularly beyond imagination cosmos. And we've got to do some thinking about, whoa, that's an invitation to help us rethink how we are living in mystery. So here's an example of the new story, or the story in between, or a travel over into a new story. This woman who came and visited yesterday, she's from England. She belongs to a Facebook group out of Vancouver that is called Worldwide Circle of Friends. And when the person who hosts this group knew that she was coming from England to Ontario, the woman who hosts this Worldwide Circle of Friends in Vancouver said, there is this phenomenal piece of Indigenous art, and if you are anywhere near it, you need to go and see it. So this woman coming from England is visiting her friends in Ottawa and says, I have been told I need to go and see this piece of phenomenal Indigenous art, and it's on a church in Picton, and is that very far away? And her friend said, oh, just a couple hours, but we can go head down and see that. So, wisdom of the universe that illustrates that new cosmology where we are all connected and nobody is outside that circle of life actually represents that new story. And we have this Judeo-Christian story that we're still trying to stay connected to, even though so much of it has, in practice, sabotaged our understanding of a new story. So, that is the introduction and the theological lecture as a backdrop to this particular passage, which I have rewritten a bit, coming from Romans. And I think as we listen to this passage and as we learn a little bit more about elephants, elephants, in so many amazing ways, have a deep, deep understanding in their DNA. It's in their DNA of how to exist as a circle of friends. So, make sure that your love is without pretense. Abhor what is evil, stick closely to what is good. Be devoted to one another as members of the cosmic circle of friends. Take the initiative in honoring one another. Don't let your enthusiasm fade. Radiate the presence of God's power. Be joyful in your hope. Be patient in your adversary. Be persistent in prayer. Treat the needs of all people and all creatures as your own. Take hospitality seriously. Ask for God's blessing on those who harass you. Ask for God's blessing, not God's curse on them. Celebrate with those who have something to be happy about. Commiserate with those who are in sorrow. Treat one another as equals. Don't entertain notions of your superiority. On the contrary, associate with ordinary people. Don't repay anyone who has injured you by injuring them. Instead, focus on what is honorable in the eyes of all people. If possible, insofar as it depends on you, be at peace with all of creation. So just a little PS here. I suspect that there are some folk who go, Lynne, you cannot go messing with Scripture. You cannot change those words. But in fact, let me read to you what the original last line was, and then how I changed it a few years ago, and then how I changed it again. And I think you'll understand that if we don't mess with some of these words, we're not going to get where we need to go. If possible, insofar as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Okay, or be at peace with all people. Or be at peace with all of creation. Okay? So I'm going to read for you elements of an interview that I listened to earlier this week. And of course, you know, it is by Krista Tippett on being. My goal in life is to ensure that everybody in my circle is listening to Krista Tippett's interviews every week. So Krista Tippett, in this, she replayed an interview actually with biologist Katie Payne, who writes, I developed a profound interest in these extremely social, long-lived beings whose intelligence is informed by deep memories and passions. Isn't that a wonderful way of describing people? Would our intelligence be informed by deep memories and passions? All right. So I kind of picked and chose. I picked and I chose. To provide us, I think, with a window of how elephants function in community. The oldest female in an elephant family is called the matriarch. She makes most of the decisions, unless you could say that the youngest baby makes most of the decisions, as you saw in the video that I showed before the service. That herd of elephants was not going anywhere until that tiniest baby finally got over the stream. So it's kind of an interesting illustration of no one gets left behind. She follows very closely what the youngest baby is up to. It is often her grandchild. On one occasion, and this is Katie, when we were watching from an observation tower that stood high above a very large forest clearing, we heard a scream from a baby way over on the east side of the clearing. Well, there were 80 elephants in front of us, but way over on the west side, one huge adult matriarch came running and ran the full length of the clearing. Well, it was the baby's grandmother. So there is a passion. There is acquaintance with the call of an animal who probably hasn't made very many calls in her life. And there is this huge sense of responsibility for the welfare of that calf. Then we saw one day, this is a very sad and very marvelous thing that we witnessed. We witnessed the death of a young calf, a yearling calf, on the clearing right in front of our observation platform. This baby had come in with her mother repeatedly. She was very thin and weak, and on that day, we knew she was going to die. She lay down, and within a couple of hours, indeed, she had died. We were keeping a video record. It was very hard and painful for us to do so. But we did this for the rest of the day and all of the next day. And during that time, more than 100 elephants, unrelated to the calf, walked past the place where the little corpse lay on the ground. Every single one of them did something that showed alarm, concern, or somehow showed that they were aware of something novel that they were approaching. Some of them took a detour around. About a quarter of them tried to lift up the body with their tusks and trunks. One adolescent male attempted to lift up this little corpse 57 times. And now these were not related animals. So the interviewer asked, how do you understand what was going on? How do you understand and talk about this? And Ms. Payne, the biologist, referred, I have to interpret it as a human. I have to say that on this occasion, it seemed that elephants were taking responsibility for other members of their species without regard for relationship at a time when they perceived someone that help was needed. So she said, how do you explain the behavior as a scientist? And Ms. Payne responds, well, I don't know whether I'm crossing a line or whether that line has been too firmly drawn in the past. My sense is that community responsibility, when it's well managed, results in peace. And peace benefits everyone. That taking care of someone or something to which you are not immediately genetically related pays you back in other dimensions. And the payback is part of your well-being. Compassion, then, is useful and beneficial for all. Right, said Krista. Compassion is often a word that you use to describe an ever-present, a quality at least, especially among the females, the matriarchs, and the families and their children. Ms. Payne responds, we do see a lot of compassion, but we also see a lot of competition and non-compassion. I mean, this is a social system, just as humans have a social system, in which elephants fight for material goods. In the case of elephants, access to mineral pits. In the case of male elephants, access to fertile females. So we saw everything from soup to nuts. It was all very interesting. Krista asked, you speak about elephants as being quite emotional. As you learned early on, as you first became interested in elephants, people who worked with them for a long time, as being very intrigued and fascinating and affectionate toward them. Ms. Payne responds, I would say if there's an animal that on the whole is more emotional than human beings, it's elephants. They have fits of delight and fits of frustration. And when a group of elephants that has been separated, even for a few hours, comes together, we would see members of the group on different sides of the clearing, and we would say, oh, they're going to meet soon. And when they met, it was the most marvelous show of total New Year's Eve, family reunion excitement, as if they'd been apart for years. And I'll play one of those at the end of the service. It's just kind of like a big party. But actually, it was only since 10 o'clock this morning that they've seen one another. They rush together, twirl their trunks together, roar, urinate, flap their ears, and the whole thing says that each individual is overcome with excitement. Krista says, you've also referred to elephants as the great listeners. Yeah, they do something marvelous that I wish we could do more of the time. This is something you do find in Quaker meetings, and Ms. Payne is a Quaker, actually, and in Buddhist meetings as well. The whole herd, and that may be 50 animals, will suddenly be still, completely still. And it's not just a stillness of voice. It's a stillness of body. So you'll be watching the moving herd. They'll be all over the place. They'll be facing all directions, doing different things. Suddenly, everything freezes, as if a movie was being turned into a still photograph. And the freeze may last a whole minute, which is a long time. They're listening. When they freeze, they tighten and lift and spread their ears. This, among other things, tells us they're concerned with what is going on over the horizon. And then Krista says, well, speaking of silence, can you tell me the story about how you became a Quaker and how that intersects with the work that you do? And Miss Payne responds, yes, I've always felt that a simpler life would be good for me. Quakers are wonderful practitioners of simplicity. They attempt to get their worldly affairs down to a dull roar so that they can help a little bit in meeting some of the world's needs. I like that. And I find that meditation, which sometimes I've done as a Quaker, sometimes in other forms, I don't know, I shouldn't maybe use the word meditation. Just being silent is a most wonderful way to open up to what is really there. I see my responsibility, if I have one, as being to listen. My church is outdoors mostly. What's sacred to me is this planet we live on. It's been here for more than 4 billion years. Life has been on it only for 3 billion years. Life as we know it, for a very short time. It's the only planet where life has been found, and that to me, I think, is ultimately what I consider sacred. And I must say that if I could ask these animals that I like so much, if there's anything equivalent to what we speak of as being faith, I would love to do that. Because we just don't know. So here we are on planet Earth, caught between two stories, two big stories. And I confess that there are times when I listen more closely to the news about devastation, and I really just want to go and put my head in the sand or curl up with grief, both of which are pretty adequate responses. But then I think again we are all invited to consider, even with our grief, how we move forward together with the things that we can do in order to be part of that new story, that intended story, that kingdom story that is illustrated within our tradition.